This is the reading assignment on asynchronous blockchains without consensus. So Nakamoto's Bitcoin protocol has taught the world how to achieve trust without a designated trusted party. The Bitcoin architecture itself provides an interesting deviation from the classical distributed systems approach through its unique proof of work consensus, and this allows anonymous participants to join and leave the network at any point without permission. The proof of work consensus has particular people known as miners, and these miners compete against each other to complete transactions by solving particular cryptographic problems on the network, and they get rewarded accordingly. The drawbacks of this consensus are mainly that the security of the system is directly related to the amount of investment in the hardware. So there's a lot of energy expenditure being put on this, and it almost becomes like an arms race for people to get more computational power. The second thing is that there might be adversaries. They can disrupt the network by bribing miners or disrupting payment reward mechanisms. The third thing being that this particular protocol, it assumes critical requirement of communication between the participants. And in other words, that just means that this protocol is vulnerable to attacks on the underlying network. Researchers have tried to address the wastefulness of POW through the proof of stake approach. In this, the miners are replaced with participants who contribute to the running of the system according to the amount of cryptocurrency they hold. And for that reason, they're called validators. As you can see, there's no hardware tool requirements, and it's not directly proportional to the amount of hardware that you have, your chances of being a miner. And finally, the energy consumption is lower compared to POW. The first drawback is that it still requires a similar level of communication. And because of that, it can also be attacked by disrupting the network. And the second thing is that it relies on randomness, but it needs to be deterministic. So to achieve consensus, the participants of the system, they repeatedly choose a leader among themselves, and that person is known as the validator. Despite being random, the choice needs to be taken collectively and in a verifiable way. And this is what complicates the problem. Introducing asynchronous blockchains without consensus. The goal of this is to relax the usual notion of consensus, and this is to extract the requirements necessary for an efficient cryptocurrency. So without full consensus, ABC cannot support certain applications. In general, it cannot support usual smart contracts. However, there are many applications that do not need smart contracts, and ABC is a better solution for these applications. In particular, ABC can implement the functionality of a cryptocurrency like Bitcoin, and it replaces the energy-hungry POW with the proof-of-stake validation. These are the various concepts that are the reason why ABC is so powerful, and we shall explore each of these independently now. First is permissionless. So the first thing is that the participants of the system are freely exchanging these tokens, and it doesn't rely on permission participation. So it's ABC in the same, it's permissionless in the same way as other proof of stake systems have. The second thing is that token holders run the system by verifying new transactions. And additionally, any token holder, they can still have another participant take his or her part in this process, and they can still preserve their ownership of the associated tokens. Next, it's asynchronous. This means that it doesn't require the messages to be delivered within any known period of time. First thing is that it's fully resilient to all the network-related threats, such as delaying the messages, DOSs, or even network eclipse attacks. The second thing is that adversaries cannot interfere with the protocol, except for extreme cases where an adversary has complete control of the network, in which case they can simply delay the progress by disabling communication or something like that. And finally, the previously approved transactions, they cannot be invalidated, and impermissible transactions, they cannot be approved. The third thing is that it's parallelizable. This means that validators running the system can parallelize the process of transactions. And the advantage of this is there's no real limit to the number of transactions a validator can process. The fourth thing is that there's a property called final. So due to the way that blockchains typically process transactions, the participants have to wait a significant amount of time before they can be confident that their transaction has been accepted by the system. For example, it usually takes around an hour for Bitcoin merchants to confirm their transactions, which is unacceptable for a lot of time-sensitive applications. This is due to the associated costs to achieve proper consensus. And since the ABC doesn't go through those, the transactions are instantly confirmed. So confirmation is final and impossible to revert. And this is a stark contrast to systems like Bitcoin, where the confidence is being confirmed only probabilistically, and it increases with the passage of time. So this is a good table, and it compares the properties of ABC with some of the most relevant existing PFT or blockchain paradigms. The smart contract functionality of Ethereum, it cannot be directly implemented with ABC, and many important applications such as cryptocurrencies or IoT systems, they do not require this consensus. And ABC is pretty much a merit in these cases. The disadvantage of PBFT is that although they are not permissionless, they are not parallelizable, and in order to make progress, they need synchronous communication. So participants of the system are called agents, and a cryptocurrency needs to be resilient to some of these agents behaving maliciously. The problem of establishing consensus in such an environment, it's called the Byzantine Agreement. And the agents behaving honestly are called honest, and the malicious agents are called the Byzantine. In the context of a cryptocurrency, some forms of consensus is used to solve this problem of double spending. In this context, according to the usual definition, achieving consensus consists of the following three requirements. The first thing being an agreement, and this basically just says that if an honest agent accepts the transaction, then every honest agent will accept it. And if there's two transactions that are conflicting or there's some sort of error between them, meaning a double spend, then this transaction wouldn't be accepted at all. The second thing is the validity of a transaction. So this basically just means that if every honest agent observes the same transaction, then that transaction is valid. The final thing is the termination property, which basically just says that every agent will accept one of the transactions. And this means that if the messages are delivered quickly, then the protocol finishes quickly. And the only change that happens in the ABC consensus is the last property, which is the honest termination instead of termination. And in this case, the only difference is that if every honest agent observes the same transaction, then that message is accepted by all the agents. And the same condition happens of messages being delivered quickly results in the protocol terminating quickly. So under this relaxed notion of consensus, if one tries to double spend, it's possible that neither will accept the transaction. So some honest agents might see the first transaction first, some honest agents might see the second transaction first, and the requirement of honest termination does not apply in that case. So the transactions might stay forever without a resolution. And this acts as a punishment mechanism, and it causes the person who was trying to send that coin or trying to cheat, and it'll cause them to lose that access to the coin. So apart from that, the consensus and ABC consensus do not really differ, and it's agreed upon results are final, conflicting results are precluded, and honest transactions are accepted quickly. So surprisingly, despite the difference being so insignificant with respect to the functioning of the cryptocurrency, the relaxation allows ABC to combine a large set of advantages.
So today I'll be trying to explain how the ABC protocol actually works. So firstly, let's get started with the notion of validators. So what are validators in our system? Let's say we have a transaction T. This transaction will have some people who are sending money. Let the public key of a person who's sending money be P1. And let's say he's sending some amount M to a P2. There can obviously be multiple people in the transaction, but let's say for sake of simplicity that it's just one person who's transferring his or her money. So now what P1 can do is, in order to validate his transaction, he can assign someone, let's call him V1, as his validator. Now V1 can also be P1 itself. So how that works is V1 now receives a stake that is equal to M. V1's stake increases by M. Now obviously the stake cannot keep rising, so it has to reduce somewhere else. So where it's reduced is actually in the previous transaction. So obviously we know that the inputs of these transactions will be the output of some other transaction. So let that transaction be T dash. So T dash must have had a validator V2 whose stake would have increased at that time by M. So now V2 stake will decrease by M. V2 minus equal to M, and V1 stake will increase. So that's how the validation, the stake is controlled in our system. So now we'll see about how the validators actually talk between themselves. So validators have the power to broadcast something known as an ACK. An ACK is a message that acknowledges the validation of a transaction. So every validator can ACK, and every ACK must consist of a reference to the previous ACK by that validator, as well as the set of transactions that this ACK is validating. So how do the ACKs actually help in finally validating a transaction? So how that works is, for every transaction to be validated, there must exist a set of ACKs in the past of this transaction. Now, what does the past of this transaction mean? The past of this transaction means all the set of ACKs that have been there in the past. We'll only consider the latest ones, and there must not be another transaction which is being validated by these ACKs that shares an input with this transaction, because otherwise there will be a case of double spending. So there must exist a subset of all these ACKs previously, such that, let's say, the validators of these ACKs are 1 to k. The sum of the delegated stake of all these validators must be greater than equal to 2/3 of the total money in the system. Now, total money of the system is obviously the entire stake that we're talking about. So obviously, since it's a proof of stake system, we believe that 2/3 of the validators are always honest. So now what happens in the case of a double spending? So as we've already seen, let's say someone is trying to double spend. There is a single output that is the input to both of these transactions. Now we can see quite intuitively that each of these transactions can never receive a validation that has a past with greater than 2/3 of the stake of validating ACKs. So what will happen in such a case? So none of the transactions, so there's a possibility that one of these transactions gets approved. And if this is approved, then the other one cannot ever be approved, because it will never reach the 2/3 of the stake required to be approved, because the other ACKs will simply not validate it once they know that someone has already spent that much. And now what is the other scenario is, both of them do not get the required ACKs for a proper transaction. So what will happen in that case is, both of these transactions will be unverified forever. So in that way, the double spender will be punished. So we assume that the person who is trying, so no honest person will ever try to double spend, which is a valid assumption. So this is what we mean when we say that we relaxed consensus. So when we relax consensus, we simply drop this condition of rejecting a transaction. Instead, we just let a double spending transaction sit there forever. The thing that we need to keep in mind is the efficiency of our system. So if we have a lot of validators in our system, naturally the verification of each transaction will take very long, because we need to find a proper subset of the ACKs of the validators, which is not a very efficient thing to do. So we have to somehow limit the total number of validators in our system. How can we do that? So let's say there is a validator with a very small stake. So we can design our protocol in such a way that such a validator will always be punished. That will lead to these validators, which are very small, forming pools, which is equivalent to how Bitcoin mining pools work. Now we'll talk about how parallelization works in our blockchain. So obviously we know that if we have, let's say, transactions which are spending the same in some, let's say, some k output of this and spending the k input again, and then again and again, if there's the same transactions, we cannot obviously process this in parallel. But this is a very edge case. If we look at thousands of people doing simultaneous transactions on a blockchain, this is better than Bitcoin, because we can actually process all these transactions asynchronously instead of something like Bitcoin, which cannot do that. So another thing that we can look at is how parallelization works. So each of our validators has some signing power which can grow without limit if we increase the computing power available to our validator. Our validator can sign thousands of transactions parallelly, and it can have a database check to see if any of the transactions are double spending. It can combine multiple transactions with the help of a Merkle tree and then broadcast them into the next stack. How can we make our system more efficient? So there is a way to prune our DAG. Any of the nodes in the system can issue a message called a checkpoint. Now what this checkpoint will do is it will appear as any other regular transaction to all the validators. It will take a set of transactions T and a set of acts, and it will summarize all the unspent outputs and the stake that was with the validators while these acts were created, and it will summarize them as a form of a regular transaction T. So now the any of the people who have had more than 2/3 of the stake in the past of T, which is basically how any of the regular transactions are approved, can approve this transaction T, and it will create a checkpoint in the system. Now all that the following acts and validators have to do is to refer to this checkpoint whenever they create new transactions. So this way they do not have to go all the way through verifying for double spending. They can simply check at this checkpoint.
Now we need to introduce a transaction fees into the system so as to incentivize the maintenance of system by validators and to prevent spamming attacks. Transaction fees can also be used as a financial punishment for the validators if they are too small, or in other words, if the delegated stake they hold is too little. Since ABC does not establish consensus, we will not choose on an agreed subset of validators. Instead, what we do is we suggest that all validators are eligible to a portion of every transaction fee. For example, suppose capital M is the total money in the system, and out of which M is the delegated stake held by a validator V. Then the fees to be received by the validator is this, where the fees might depend upon the size of the representation of T. Now in ABC, unlike Bitcoin, the fees cannot easily be determined by a market mechanism, as we need more than 2/3 of validator power to sign the transaction. In ABC, agents can freely decide whom to choose as their validator, and hence such a system helps in providing the validators an incentive to provide the best conditions to the agents who delegate their stake to them. For example, a validator can reimburse the agents that have delegated their stake to them, or the protocol itself might automatically share the transaction fees of the validator with the money holders. On the other hand, the problems faced are it is impossible to prevent a validator from being too large or having too much stake. Validator holding more than the threshold stake can hide under multiple identities. But these problems are not exclusive to just ABC, but all the blockchain protocols face this issue. Now, if the fees are collected according to the scheme described previously, the fees paid by the transaction issuers is equal to the fees collected by validators. But there may exist transactions that are never acted by some validators. This would lead to destruction of money with total amount shrinking over the time. But what we need is we might want that the amount of money increases over time. So what we do is introduce some percent new money each year as an inflation target. This provides agents as an incentive to not hoard the money but to use it in the system. Validator with a delegated stake M would receive transaction fee this, where A is some constant greater than 1. ABC can actually also make use of proof of work for distribution of new money in an unbiased way. The transactions could be allowed to include proof of work and receive an extra amount of stake to spend as an output. Now, open smart contracts are not easily possible with ABC. Imagine two partners having a joint account and both want to make a transaction simultaneously. This can be seen as a conflicting transaction or a double spend. So the two partners need to be sure that they are not using the same input at the same time. For example, they can initially set up a transaction that sends the money from their joint account to two new accounts that the partners individually hold, and then they can spend the money from their individual accounts. This problem gets worse with completely open smart contracts that can be called by anybody in the network. We need to augment ABC with a mechanism to order transaction, and this leads us back to having to implement a full consensus. Now, traditional BFT and blockchain protocols totally order all transactions, but this is the root of all problems as it introduces an inherent bottleneck in the design of the system. Now, we can compare our system with some of these permission systems like the distributed ledger. These operate with a carefully selected committee of trusted machines. Such systems are called permissioned. The committee agrees on a transaction, votes on and commits that transaction, and only then moves forward to agree on that on the next transaction. Permission transaction system not relying on consensus. This was a system proposed by Saurabh Gupta. In this design, a static set of validators is designated to confirm transactions, and the concepts of parallelization, fees, etc. do work in this permission setting as well. The consensus number of a cryptocurrency. This shows that the consensus number of a cryptocurrency like Bitcoin is 1. That means that consensus is not needed. This paper also provides an analysis and discussion of which applications rely on consensus and to what extent. Honeybadger BFT provides an asynchronous permission system by relying on advanced cryptographic techniques with full consensus. Again, the main differences from ABC are that system is permissioned, much more involved, and reliant on randomization. Dynamic Byzantine Reliable Broadcast introduce a protocol based on reliable broadcast that allows participants to join and leave the system. In contrast to ABC, the protocol consists of multiple rounds of communication to agree on nodes joining or leaving the system and does not feature a functionality to delegate one's role in maintaining the system. Our system can also be compared to these permissionless systems like Bitcoin. ABC allows permissionless participation like Bitcoin, but in contrast to Bitcoin, ABC does not rely on proof of work or randomization. It also features parallelization and finality and works under full asynchrony. Now, Ouroboros and Algorand are two proof of stake blockchains that proof of stake blockchains that solve consensus and thus do not parallelize without compromises. The reliance on synchronous communication and randomization in proof of stake are potential security risks. And Spectre is probably the closest relative to ABC among such protocols as it relaxes consensus similarly to ABC, but this is the only similarity that Spectre and ABC hold. So in conclusion, ABC is asynchronous blockchain without consensus, which provides functionality of Bitcoin without consensus, without proof of work, without requiring synchronous communication, without relying on randomness. It is scalable with finality. It is the advantageous solution for applications like cryptocurrencies, but it needs another layer of indirection for implementing open smart contracts. Thank you.